Um, the East Asian group that is closest to the source population for the Amerindian people is the Nivk people of the Amur River Basin. The Amur is a river between China and Russia that flows out to the Pacific Ocean, and there was a fairly sizable hunter-gatherer population there. We have some ancient DNA samples from a place called Devil's Cave, and those are usually the samples used to reference kind of these East Asian populations, um, within kind of the ancient period. Um, there's also another group that, for this talk, I'm mostly relying on Pavel Flagantov's paper from last October called The Genomic Formation of First American Ancestors in East and Northeast Asia. So that's probably 90% of the talk is going to be based off this paper. So you can look it up yourself, read it. It's very fascinating, a lot of really interesting stuff. He's actually using, he does point out that the Nivk people, as well as the Tungusic people, the Manchus who ruled China for a few hundred years, starting in 1644 all the way till 1911, they were a Tungusic people, are very much the descendants of the people who lived in the Amur River Basin, thousands and, 10,000 years ago. He's using here the Huato site in kind of central Manchuria, um, for, these ancient peoples, that eventually contributed ancestry to, the Amerindians. So this, you have those East Asian peoples. You also have a group of people called the ancestral North Eurasians. They don't really exist anymore. But they do exist all over. Europeans have quite a bit of their ancestry as to Amerindians. They lived in kind of probably from Central Asia, Lake Balkhash, the Aral Sea, all the way over to the Yenisei River in Siberia, modern day like Novosibirsk, Irkutsk, really more towards the Irkutsk area. And the third group of people that are important in the whole peopling of the Americas, and they're actually not that important, but they do cause some interesting issues. I will call the Australasians or the Para-Australoids. And they do have living descendants, the peoples of Papua New Guinea, the Negrito peoples of kind of Southeast Asia and the Philippines, as well as the Australian Aborigines, are kind of from that population. Now, Australasian is a very, very deep clade for genetics. Like the East Asian peoples, for instance, they largely descend from groups that lived, about 15, 20,000 years ago. And there's been repeated spreads from what looks like it's southern China, that have kind of mixed the different East Asian groups and kept them fairly closely related. For these kind of Australasian people, that hasn't been the case. They split off very early from everyone else, 40, 50,000 years ago. And they never, even though they did have some expansions, most notably at Papua New Guinea, about 15,000 BC, and then again about 3,000 BC. They haven't really, spread out and kind of homogenized themselves the way that other populations have. So when I'm saying this ancestry is Australasian, it's not literally from Papua New Guinea or, that kind of Southeast Asia area. It's these the northern parts of this population which have been swept aside in the big wanderings and various invasions of the last few thousand years. In particular, the island of Japan, the Jomon people who lived in Japan before the Japanese invaded and mostly exterminated them. It was actually about 50% this kind of Australasian in ancestry. So they were very, very distinctive from the Japanese of today. So we have the three groups. We have the Australasians, we have the East Asians, and we have the ancestral North Eurasians. Now, the Australasians lived all the way up in admixed form at least, all the way up to the Amur River Basin, where the people that were living there in the last ice age were maybe about like 10% Australasian in ancestry, with the rest of their ancestry being East Asian. And it's barely detectable at this point just because there's been so much expansion from East Asian peoples, the Chinese in particular. But way back in the day, it would have been noticeable and they would have been a distinct population. So these three groups, they go and they combined in various forms in kind of eastern Siberia, and they go and they form a lot of these population groups that play a big role in the Americas. The Americas were connected by what used to be called Beringia. There was a land bridge connecting Alaska with Kamchatka. That's a very far eastern part of Asiatic Russia. And it's possible that people could have crossed over there as early as 40,000 BC. There are, or hominids, I could also say, there are some signs of animal butchery in Alaska dating back to about 30,000 BC, as well as some sites with fires in Mexico, also around 30,000 BC. Whoever these people or hominids were, they didn't leave a trace. They either died off, they were ephemeral, killed in the various climate changes, or, were destroyed by the ancestors of the Amerindian peoples who we're familiar with. Whatever or whoever they were, if they're not just misdatings or, mistakes, errors, frauds, whatever, they were definitely a primitive people, which is why I think it's more likely they're hominids and not humans. We don't see the megafaunal expansions that you normally see with the spread of humans. That's actually one of the best ways of telling if when humans got to an area, it's when all the megafauna, the woolly mammoths, the saber-toothed tigers, those giant creatures that roamed around the world in the last ice age, it's when they get wiped out that you can usually tell that kind of modern humans have arrived. Since we're very good, as endurance hunters, we have technology, like throwing spears, that kind of thing, that can really wreck these big animals. And they have a lot of meat, which makes them very, very appealing for hunting. So whoever, whatever these things were, if they existed that made it to the Americas 40 to 30,000 years ago, they did not survive. So going back to Siberia, there's all sorts of stuff that's going on between about 20,000 and 15,000 BC. And it's hard to get a lot of resolution. There's only a handful of these very old and ancient sites. So there is a lot of guesswork. What it looks like is that there were really three separate, definitely more than three, groups that were kind of forming in eastern Siberia at this time that eventually became, the Amerindian peoples. And they would have actually diverged from each other a lot within Siberia, not within the Americas. So you have these three separate groups. One of them is called the Southern, Flegontov calls them the SNAs, the Southern Native Americans. And the Southern Native Americans, the SNAs, I'll call them, they go and they actually, the East Asian population that mixes with the ancestral Northern Eurasian population, their East Asian component does have that kind of Australasian-like ancestry, that characterizes, the peoples of Australia, of Papua New Guinea, of Japan, Japan before the Japanese arrived. And the other group, it mixed with East Asian people that did not have that kind of ancestry. And that became, those people became the NNAs, the Northern Native Americans. And there was a third group that actually mixed with a group that was further to the west, within Siberia, and these became the Beringians. Now, these three groups, it looks like the SNA group crossed the, Beringia first, and they migrated. My guess is, now the interesting thing is they don't really have that much, ancestry within North America, or within Mexico or anything. They're really restricted to South America. Now, why didn't they leave any trace within North America? It's an interesting question, and I think it's actually been answered in March. So, we can detect within some Amerindian tribes that there's this ancestry of a group called Population Y, and I believe this is the SNA people, or at least a lot of their ancestry. They have this Australasian ancestry, and they're only found in South America. Now, what I believe happened is that the SNA people carrying this Australasian ancestry actually kind of took the Kelp Road. That's a kind of maritime region right along the Pacific coast, all the way from Alaska down through California, into the Sea of Cortez and everything. And it would have provided a lot of, there's clams, there's all sorts of animals you can eat when you're on your way, down the coast. And I think that the SNA people, when they crossed over, probably about 14,000 BC or so, they took this coastal route rather than pressing into the interior. Um, there's also signs for this in archaeology. There's difference, the tools that are used by certain groups, particularly in Mexico, as well as the Pacific coast, of the modern day United States, as well as Mexico. Um, they go and they're more for like grinding plant materials or seafood, that sort of thing. Whereas the tools that are found, like east of Texas in the modern day eastern United States, eastern Canada, are more for big game hunting and that sort of thing. Um, my belief is that the NNA people were, the ones that were the big game hunters. They would have pursued the woolly mammoths, the, those giant armadillo-like things that used to roam around into what's the modern day eastern United States, eastern Canada. Um, and eventually would have pursued the big game into Mexico. Whereas you had the SNA people who were limited to the coastal route. They would have just followed the coast all the way down to, through Central America, through South America, and eventually ended up in Patagonia. They did reach Patagonia all the way in 10,600 BC. So it only took them 3,400 years to make it from Alaska to the very bottom. So it's actually very impressive. The earliest sites we have in Patagonia, that's southern Argentina, I mean, they're very primitive. They didn't have seafaring. The canoes and stuff were actually not invented for another, 5,900 years. It wasn't until 4,700 BC that we see the, canoes and harpoons there. No, of course, it could just be they developed those a lot earlier, and just they don't appear in the archaeological record until 4700 BC, all the way down there in Patagonia. But it does not look like they had that technology when they crossed over. So most likely, they were just taking the coastal route, and once they kind of colonize the coast, that's when they start to spread into the interior. Now the NNA people, they go and with their big game hunting, they end up kind of colonizing most of North America and overrunning these groups that are within on the even on the Pacific coast. Unfortunately, the doing genetics research for Amerindians in the United States and Canada is very difficult for political reasons. So a lot of this stuff, we're very reliant on the South American and Central American countries, which are a lot more open in science, since people there are a lot more interested in learning about their heritage. Um, it does appear possible that the Chumash people of, kind of Southern California, Santa Barbara area, the Channel Islands, they might have more ancestry related to the SNA people than the NNA people. So they very well might be kind of the Pacific Coast remnant of, these SNA people on their migration south. Um, there is a sample from Central America, I believe in Nicaragua, that does show the kind of Australasian-like ancestry, and this is about 10,000 years ago, that you only see in the South American Amerindian groups these days. So, a lot of these tribes were definitely wiped out by the expansion of the NNA people as they migrated south. Now, what's also interesting is you would expect that within the South American Amerindian populations, you would have kind of a homogeneity within their amount of kind of that Australasian ancestry. You'd expect it to be around the 4% you see in some tribes. And that's actually not the case. There's some tribes with very little of it. Um, what it looks like happened was there was an expansion, possibly related to the adoption of agriculture within Mesoamerica, where the Mesoamericans would have spread into South America and diluted that ancestry of the kind of Australasians. So the peoples of the Andes and kind of the northern part of South America had less of the kind of Australasian-like ancestry that the remaining tribes would not have. You even see that in the Amazon too. There was the explorer Francisco de Orellana, when he was sailing through the Amazon River, he actually stumbled across this whole Amerindian civilization, which has largely faded away. Well, they died off from disease actually. Um, and they had some very cool stuff. They had tree-based agriculture. They were planting trees and lines. They would go and light fires to create this stuff called the terra preta, kind of like a black earth. That was very good for their kind of jungle agriculture. Just a very unique form of agriculture that I'm not aware of being practiced anywhere else in the world. And they created a fairly, stratified civilized society from what De Oriana describes, as well as some of the temples and sites we found from some of the Amazonian islands. Anyhow, these agricultural populations, they may have had their roots in these kind of Mesoamerican societies from the BCs, maybe as early as 2000, 1000 BC with the Olmecs, those sorts of groups. You would have had, the Olmecs, in older literature, you'll see the argument that rather than spreading their language, which was most likely an Otomanguean language, that's the Amerindian languages you see in southern parts of Mexico, like Oaxaca, they would have had kind of this religious priestly class, that would have practiced kind of self-mutilation, and had all sorts of bizarre practices, and you can kind of see the results of their self-mutilation with those weird African-looking stone heads. I mean, they're not actually Africans. That's just the way, they might have done something like head binding, like what the Huns did. And these magicians would have transmitted their culture, stuff about agriculture. They would have had stuff like the rain dance, sacrifices to the rain god, Tlaloc, he's the big one for the Aztecs, and their equivalents. So you would have had this kind of ecumen, for the Amerindians of Mesoamerica, and that would have given them this advantage to spread into South America and spread possibly civilization and this kind of jungle agriculture. That's very hypothetical for sure. That would explain a lot of the weird genetics results, though, for why different South American groups have, varying amounts of this kind of Australasian ancestry. Even weirder, within the South American groups, you'll see within groups you have variance in this amount of Australasian ancestry. You would expect for kind of isolated tribes that haven't been interacting with others for hundreds and thousands of years in some points. We can see this in genetics, how inbred they are, how, kind of the average size of their population, that all appears in the genome. And, we see these very inbred tribes that have been isolated for very long amounts of time that did not really intermarry with any of their neighbors, and were very primitive. And they actually have within them variable amounts of this kind of Australasian ancestry. So it's possible all this is completely wrong and it's just a measurement error. My belief is that what happened is, and we see this historically from North America, with the formation of the Seminoles and similar tribes, where after kind of the giant die-offs caused by the introduction of European and African diseases, you have different tribes kind of mesh together, and form new tribes like the Seminoles. And my guess is something similar happened to that in South America, which is why we see these kind of weird results where there's a heterogeneity within tribes. for this amount of the kind of Australasian-like ancestry. Basically, you'd have one tribe, maybe they'd be rich in the Australasian type ancestry, and then you have another tribe that would be poor in it. And, after the kind of diseases were killing everyone off, they, intermarried amongst each other. Um, and then, that's why you have these interesting results. Regardless, it's very hypothetical. More research is definitely needed, and I will definitely keep you guys appraised of it if I read anything on my Twitter feed. So that's going a little bit ahead of ourselves. So going all the way back to the peoplings, we have the two big groups. We have the Ananes, which have taken over North America, and then we have the Essenes, who take over South America, and then the Ananes, at some point, probably in the agricultural period, go and colonize South America and mix with them. So there's also stuff that's going on much further to the north. So within Alaska, there was actually a group of people who I'll call the Beringians. That's what Fligontov calls them in his great paper. And they were actually enriched for more kind of Western Siberian ancestry. They actually had split from the Amerindians about 4,000 to 6,000 years before the other two groups of Amerindians had split from each other. So perhaps, around 20,000 BC or so. And it's hard to say when these Beringians migrated, but they did go to Alaska. And they died there. They don't have any descendants. They were wiped out by their successors, who were actually somewhat important. So, technology, within a very, very broad historical, view, East Asia, China in particular, is kind of the center of the world. And there was a culture in kind of around Lake Baikal area, modern day Irkutsk, called the Sialach culture. And the Sialach culture was a, kind of Neolithic Neolithic group. They had polished stone tools, they had ceramics, they had bone harpoons and arrows. So they were actually much more advanced than any kind of Amerindian group. And this Sialach culture, around, I believe, yeah, because their first sites are in the 4000s, the 5th millennium BC. They went and they go and invade kind of the far northeast of what do you call it, Siberia, Kamchatka, Chukotka, probably around 4500 BC, and annihilate them. I mean, it's pretty much just a straight genocide. I think they just killed all of them. And that was normal for hunter-gatherer tribes. They wouldn't have spoken each other's languages. They would have viewed their kind of Amerindian-like. I mean, I say Amerindian-like because they're not Amerindians, but that's the closest surviving group to them. People, they would have probably seen them as primitive. Like, to get some idea, a lot of these tribes, their names for themselves was literally the people, and their names for their neighbors was the enemy. I mean, I believe you can see this, like the Navajo, they called the Puebloan peoples the Anasazi, their ancient enemies, and they're far, far from the only people to do that. So hunter-gatherer societies were very, very violent. They had, limited amounts. They did not have much of an agricultural surplus. They were just competing for the same hunting and fishing grounds, so things would get very ugly very quickly. So these Sialach people are very interesting, since they would have almost certainly spoken a Dene-Yeniseian language. Now, the Dene-Yeniseian languages, it's very interesting. You have a language called Ket, which is spoken all the way in western Siberia, in the Yenisei River Basin. And then you have the Navajo language, which is in kind of northeastern Arizona and the southwestern United States. And there's a great linguist, his name was Edward Vida, and he actually proved, very convincingly, that this Ket language in western Siberia is actually related to Navajo. And Navajo is actually just one of several languages. The Apache people right next to the Navajo, also in Arizona, speak this language in the same family as do the Athabascan people of kind of northern Canada. So these, Nadene, I'll call them the Dene-Yeniseian people. They go and they invade kind of northeastern, Siberia, and wipe out the Amerindian-like people there. probably around 4500 BC. And they presumably win because they have bows and their predecessors do not. Even though the Amerindians had throwing spears, it was nothing on the lines of what bows could do. So, having conquered that region, they proceed to migrate into America right around 2500 BC. So it takes them around 2,000 years to cross over. Um, so they go and they end up becoming the Sakak culture of Greenland. They become the independence cultures of northeastern Canada. They also became the Dorset culture. So you have all these kind of Ndene, Navajo-like people, I should say. They're living all the way up in the far north. They completely overrun their kind of NNA predecessors. And, it varies, like in the very far north in Greenland. It looks like it was just a straight genocide. They killed everyone. Whereas in other areas, they did mix, like the Athabascan people, for instance, did go and mix with their kind of NNA predecessors further south. I think the key was that in very marginal Arctic environments, there wasn't much of a surplus. They basically had to kill people. Whereas, in areas where you have more dense fisheries, you could set yourself up as a ruling class and, kind of extract resources from the defeated peoples, and, you wouldn't have to wipe them out necessarily. They are very distinctive since these people do have, this kind of Siberian-like ancestry. When they crossed over, the Amerindians would have definitely been able to see the differences between them and these Dene-Yeniseian peoples. And if you go to, like Russia, you can run into some of these Siberian peoples, and you'll see they, do have their kind of, they don't look like East Asians or Amerindians. They do have their own very interesting look. Kind of like reddish skin almost, kind of high cheekbones. It's difficult to describe. But they would have definitely been very distinctive, especially in the early days. So they go, and at the same time, you have around 2200 BC to 2000. So right after these kind of Dene-Yeniseian peoples are invading North America, there's this other big catastrophe that actually affects the whole world. So there's these things called Bond events, which, I believe they're named after this climatologist guy called Bond. And, he had this theory that, every couple hundred years, there's these climate shifts that you can see in ice cores. And one of those big climate shifts took place right around 2200 BC. And there were changes basically all over the world. You see the, Indo-Iranian groups go and invade Central Asia at the time. You see, there's all sorts of political chaos in, the Middle East. Egypt goes, the old kingdom of Egypt collapses into the first intermediate period. There's this second round of Indo-European conquests in, Europe. Just all sorts of crazy stuff is happening, and it definitely affected the far north as well. You have the ancestors of the Samietic peoples and the Sami peoples, who are in kind of northern Siberia at this time, within the Ob-Irtish rivers in western Siberia, which connect all the way up to the Arctic Sea. And they actually, go and they contact and mix with the ancestors of the Inuit, or I should really say the Yukagir people. The Yukagir people, they're kind of a people in northeastern Siberia. And also, you have the ancestors of the Inuit, as well as the ancestors of the Chukchi and the Aleuts, who are also living in Siberia at this time. And, they go and they create this kind of circumpolar ecumen where, they're trading with each other. They spread, they've got this unique type of, weaving for their clothing. So you have this kind of circumpolar culture, which has a Yakut name, which I can't pronounce at all. It's, I think you have to be Yakut to actually pronounce it correctly. It's very difficult. It's like the Imi-Gataya culture or something. I'm not even going to try to say it. So around 2200 to 1800 BC, you see the expansion of this kind of circumpolar group within Eurasia. And this affects the Dene-Yeniseian people. in kind of northeastern Siberia as well. They when you have kind of these larger trade and cultural networks, you can definitely spread technology a lot easier. And that's what I believe gave the kind of ancestors, the Inuits, the Yukagir, the Chukchi, and the Aleuts, all these advantages, and they go and invade northeastern Siberia, take over Kamchatka and Chuktoa, and wipe out kind of the Dene-Yeniseian peoples there. Obviously, some of the Dene-Yeniseian people survive, further south in like the Lake Baikal area, um, but they did not survive in the northeast. Um, so while all this is happening, you go and the Dene people are spreading south. I believe you can tell it from the spread of bows and arrows. You would have, there is one really cool site. Um, from one of the Channel Islands off the coast of Los Angeles. And it's from the 13th centuries, the 1200s. And one of the Chumash Amerindians there actually has a great grandparent that would have been either an Aleut or an Dene. And I kind of go back and forth on, what this guy was. Um, you know, there was a lot of stuff going on kind of from the 1000 to 1450 period within the American Southwest and Southern California. Um, right around 1000 AD, you see the spread of kind of a new bow technology, the cottonwood points, all around Southern California. It's normally associated with the spread of the Takic peoples. Um, my belief is it's possible that you had either Aleut sea raiders, from Alaska, um, or kind of Dene people who had been migrating to the Southwest, who spread this kind of bow technology amongst some of the peoples of the American Southwest. Um, again, I guess I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Um, so we have the kind of Dene-Yeniseian peoples getting wiped out by 1800 BC by the kind of ancestors of the Inuits. So the Inuits go and they have all this really cool technology that enables them to survive in the far north better, and they go and they spread into the Americas as well. They go and within the historical period, actually, after Viking settlement, they go and destroy the kind of Dene-Yeniseian peoples of Greenland. You have Amerindian groups that go and overrun them, kind of in Nova Scotia and that area as well. I think the Beothuk people are the ones who destroyed kind of the Dene-Yeniseian peoples within northeastern Canada. It does look like there was a huge expansion, right around the beginning of the second millennium AD, out of kind of northeastern Canada and the northeastern United States, where the Algonquian peoples and their relatives, definitely migrated south, as well as west, overrunning a lot of different peoples. What caused it, I'm not sure. But that was kind of a more of a spread of NNA related ancestry, and it looks like that might have affected the American Southwest as well. Um, and the other thing too, so you have the Dene-Yeniseian people who are getting wiped out by the Inuit in the far north. Some of them actually end up going and migrating to the south, where they became very famous actually. Um, so the ancestors of the Navajo and the Apache were actually pretty heavily mixed in with the NNA people, by the time you get to 1000 AD or so. And you have this kind of power vacuum in the Southwest. You have climate change, things are drying up. You have all sorts of political conflicts going on in Mesoamerica that are possibly disrupting the trade routes. Mesoamerica had a huge cultural reach, all the way into the mouth of the Mississippi. Looks like there was some sort of sea trade route that went along. It also looks like there was another one that went up kind of the Mexican coast on the Pacific, up the Sea of Cortez through the Colorado River, where the Yuman peoples, that's Yuman, as well as the other Puebloan peoples who were living in the Arizonan tributaries of the Colorado, were all kind of connected to this trade network. They had things like ball courts, um, and it looks like they were exporting copper and other things to Mesoamerica, mostly as trinkets, though, like bells, that kind of thing. And in return, they get like quetzal feathers and cultural stuff. There's actually a ball court you can see in southern Arizona at a place called Casa Grande, which is very neat to check out if you're ever there. Um, so this kind of, Puebloan peoples of the American Southwest, they go and, climate change, they have, start to decline. They start to build a lot of fortifications in the 14th century. And that's also when you see you've got two expansions that are going on. You have the Numic expansion. The Numix were an Uto-Aztecan people originally from kind of San Bernardino County area in Southern California, which is a very kind of shrubbery desert area. Definitely not a very civilized area. They were kind of hunter-gatherers. Um, and they were related to the Aztecs distantly. They'd shared ancestors within, I believe, 2,000 or 3,000 years. So these Numic people, they had bow and arrows. They overran a lot of their neighbors. Looks like they wiped out the Fremont culture of Utah and kind of set themselves up as a ruling class. And some of the Puebloan groups, like the Hopi, for instance, who speak a weird Uto-Aztecan language. And I think that's the result of kind of the Numic ruling class setting itself up on, the Hopi Kivas and their kind of, mixed language is what a Hopi is. Because the Hopi do have ancestral memories of themselves being the Puebloan peoples. I don't think they're entirely wrong. I think it's just like the sort of like the Bulgarians, where they speak a Slavic language, even though their original ruling class was a Turkic in origin. I think it was something. I think it's something similar for the Hopi. At the same time, there's all sorts of stuff. There's this power vacuum. The Puebloan peoples are fleeing. These kind of Numic hunter-gatherers are overrunning the southwestern civilizations of the Pueblos. That's when you have the Dene-Yeniseian people, the Navajo and the Apaches. They go and invade around this time too. From the north, they're migrating all the way from Alaska down south. And they go and they mix in with the locals too. So, only like 6 to 10% of their ancestry is from the original like Dene-Yeniseian peoples that crossed over, those, in 2800 or, BC or whatever it was. Most of their ancestry is from kind of the NNA people who they've conquered and mixed with for the last, 4,800 years or so. So they're, but they definitely still speak the language that, are a descendant of the language that was originally spoken in kind of the Lake Baikal area. So that's kind of the main thing for the peopling of the Americas. The Caribbean has kind of an interesting history as well. It wasn't settled till later, and it looks like there were 4 or 5 different migrations. Most recently with the Carib people who migrated over in kind of the late Middle Ages, maybe around 1300 to 1500 or so, not long before Columbus, actually. And from what it looks like, they pretty much killed all of the people that were in, the islands they had settled. So that was kind of interesting. They were not a nice people. Looks like they were from the Orinoco River Basin originally. It looks like the original, and they were like the 4th or 5th group to invade the Caribbean. So they, their predecessors were not natives by any means. The original group that settled the Caribbean might have been from the Yucatan, and I think that might be related to the kind of Mesoamerican agricultural expansion. You see kind of, maybe in the 3rd or 2nd millennium BC, associated with the Olmec priestly class, the spread of this like kind of like ecumen of the Mesoamericans. It's possible they organized, kind of sea expeditions and settled out in the islands. Of course, that's just wild mass guessing, but I think it's possible and it makes sense. The dates line up, and until proven otherwise, that is what I will believe. So, of course, more research is always needed and wonderful. So, then I'll go back to, kind of Patagonia, that's southern Argentina. The population didn't really, is very marginal up until about 1500 BC, and you start seeing a spread of more northern influences. Um, you have, let me look through here, going off my notes. There were several cultural shifts in southern Patagonia, like the Tierra del Fuego in that area. Um, in the earliest, let me look through here. Yeah, they had different cultures. They were in different mountain ranges. The main distinction was between the coastal groups and the inland groups. The inland groups were more closely related to kind of the settled agricultural peoples of Peru and the Andes, whereas the coastal peoples were, very distinctive and, descended from other coastal peoples. And that's a pattern you see in a lot of prehistory. Kind of folk wanderings are associated more with kind of like ecological shifts, or where people has the cultural toolkit that enables them to exploit a certain ecology, and they're not really that successful in exploiting other ecologies. And this was especially true before the Metal Ages. With the adoption of metal, once people could, you'd kind of a specialized blacksmith class that definitely changed cultures and made them a lot more adaptable. Since you get up this blacksmith class that could make you all sorts of really cool tools. So that's all I have to say. I know that's a lot of material to go over. The main thing I would just remember is there were 5 migrations. First, it was the SNAs with their kind of Australasian-like ancestry. Second, it was the NNAs. Third, it was the Beringian people who got totally wiped out. Fourth, you have the Navajo Apache-like people, the Dene-Yeniseians, or the Dene. And fifth, you have the Inuit. And with that, I will open it up for questions.